The air was thick with tension as Officer Daniels tightened his grip on his baton. He sneered at the woman in front of him, his eyes full of hatred. "You think you can just walk through here, huh?" He barked at the black woman standing still, her hands trembling by her sides. His voice echoed across the empty street, where the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. The woman didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, though her heart was pounding in her chest. But just as Officer Daniels raised his baton, ready to strike, something incredible happened. A sleek black SUV screeched to a halt beside them, its tires squealing in protest. The doors flew open, and 3 men, dressed in sharp suits and dark sunglasses, jumped out. They moved swiftly, their eyes scanning the area like hawks. They weren't here for small talk. The woman, who had remained calm under Daniel's cruel threats, seemed to exhale with relief as she saw them. The Secret Service team had arrived. Before Officer Daniels could process what was happening, one of the men from the team stepped forward. He was tall, with a calm demeanor, but his presence was commanding. "Step back, officer," he said in a low, controlled voice. Daniel's face twisted with disbelief. This wasn't how he thought his day would go. He had underestimated the woman standing before him. The tension in the air was palpable. Daniels hesitated, unsure of what to do next. The Secret Service agent didn't wait for him to make a decision. He took a step forward, his movements deliberate. "You don't want to do this," he warned, his hand resting casually on the sidearm hidden beneath his suit jacket. Officer Daniels' baton lowered slightly, but his anger didn't fade. "I'm not afraid of you," he spat, but there was a crack in his voice now, a sign that the confidence he once had was slipping. The woman watched the exchange silently, her face unreadable. She knew what was coming, but she didn't let it show. As the Secret Service agent took another step closer, Officer Daniels took a deep breath, his hands still gripping his baton tightly. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, without warning, the agent spoke again. "You're making a mistake. Walk away now." And just like that, the standoff was broken. Daniels glanced at the woman one last time, his fists clenching, but then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked back to his patrol car, leaving the woman standing with the Secret Service team. It was over, but only for now. The sun had barely begun to set when the events unfolded, casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. Officer Daniels, who had grown up in this town, knew everyone. He was known as a man who took his job seriously, but his attitude had always been one of superiority. The woman he had encountered, however, was not someone he expected to see in his jurisdiction. She wasn't just any regular person. She had secrets. Her name was Maria Washington, and she had worked for the government in a position so high that few knew her true identity. But as the evening wore on, Daniels would learn that Maria wasn't someone he could push around, even if he wanted to. Maria's job had always been behind the scenes, behind closed doors, working in the shadows where no one could see her. It wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous, but it was a job she took pride in. The Secret Service team she called her own wasn't just a protection detail. They were her family. They had saved her more times than she cared to admit. And now, they were here again, saving her from Officer Daniels' racist aggression. But the truth was, Daniels had no idea who Maria really was. He had no clue what she was capable of, or why the Secret Service team was so protective of her. To him, she was just another black woman walking down the street, and that was enough to make him act out. But now, as he drove away, his mind was racing. Who was that woman? Why had the Secret Service team come to her aid so quickly? Maria knew that the encounter was far from over. She had been trained to stay calm under pressure, to think several steps ahead. But even she couldn't have predicted what was coming next. As the night grew darker, she prepared herself for the inevitable. Officer Daniels would be back. She just didn't know when. Earlier that day, Maria had been walking down a quiet street, minding her own business. It wasn't unusual for her to be in the area. In fact, she often liked to take walks to clear her mind. She had grown used to being alone in public spaces, surrounded by the sounds of city life, the hum of distant conversations, the occasional honk of a car. But today, something felt different. She had noticed the patrol car parked a little too close to her path, its lights dimmed, but the engine still running. She had passed by the car earlier in the morning, but it hadn't been there then. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now, as she walked by again, she noticed the officer sitting in the front seat, his eyes trained on her. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't scared. She was used to being watched, used to being scrutinized. But she also knew that not everyone who looked at her saw her as a person. To some, she was just another black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was the problem. As she continued down the street, she could feel the officer's gaze following her every step. It wasn't unusual for her to be followed by law enforcement, but today it felt different. Today, it felt like he wasn't just watching her, he was judging her. And that was something she couldn't ignore. Maria picked up her pace, hoping to get out of his line of sight. But it was too late. The patrol car slowly pulled up beside her, and the officer, now out of the car, stepped onto the sidewalk. "Hey," he called to her, his voice low and threatening. "Where do you think you're going?" Maria froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't answer right away. She couldn't. She wasn't sure what to say. Her mind raced as she tried to gauge the situation. She could feel the tension building in the air, and she knew something was about to happen. "Answer me," the officer demanded, his voice rising. "Where do you think you're going?" The situation was escalating, and Maria could feel the anger in his voice. She wasn't going to back down, though. She had faced worse before. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. Just then, the SUV appeared out of nowhere, screeching to a halt beside them. The doors slammed open, and the three men from the Secret Service team stepped out, all business. Maria's eyes met theirs, and for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of relief. But the relief was short-lived. Officer Daniels wasn't about to back down easily. He wasn't done yet. As the team moved in, ready to intervene, Maria could feel the tension in the air once more. This was far from over. The night had turned colder, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement as the Secret Service team flanked Maria, their presence intimidating. Officer Daniels, still holding his baton, glared at them, his eyes burning with anger. His fingers twitched at the handle of his weapon as he sized up the situation, clearly outnumbered but unwilling to back down. "You think you can just show up and intimidate me?" he barked at the team, his voice trembling slightly with fury. The agent in the middle, the one who had spoken to him earlier, didn't flinch. He stood tall, unfazed by the officer's threat. "We're not here to intimidate you," the agent replied coolly. "We're here to ensure that no one breaks the law. And you're about to break several." Officer Daniels took a step forward, his chest puffed out in defiance. "I'm a cop," he spat. "I don't need permission from anyone to do my job." Maria watched the exchange carefully, feeling the growing tension in her bones. She wasn't afraid of Daniels, but she knew this wasn't going to end easily. She had seen people like him before. People who believed their badge gave them the right to do whatever they wanted, no matter who they hurt along the way. But she wasn't just anyone. She had a reputation of her own. The agent in front of Daniels raised an eyebrow. "You're not doing your job. You're harassing a civilian based on her race." "That's not your job, officer." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying authority in it that made Daniels hesitate. "Get out of my way," Daniels growled, pushing past the agent. He took another step toward Maria, but before he could reach her, one of the other agents moved in quickly, blocking his path. "This is your final warning, officer," the second agent said firmly. "Step away now." Daniel's face reddened with anger, and for a moment, it seemed like he was going to lash out. His hands trembled, and the baton in his grip shook. The situation was rapidly escalating, and Maria could feel her heartbeat quicken. She was ready for it to end. But she knew the officers wouldn't just walk away quietly. Something was going to give. Maria held her breath. She had never been in a situation quite like this before. Her role had always been to stay hidden, to keep a low profile, and to stay out of the public eye. But now, for the first time in a long while, her life was exposed to the world. She didn't know if the Secret Service would be able to keep her safe from Officer Daniels, or if he would back down and walk away. Just then, something unexpected happened. A car sped down the street, its tires screeching as it came to a sudden halt just behind the group. The engine roared to life again as the door slammed open, and another man stepped out, this time. A familiar face from Maria's past. The moment the man stepped into view, Maria's body tensed. It was Charles, a former associate who had once been part of her team before everything went south. She hadn't seen him in years, and the last time they spoke, it hadn't ended well. Maria hadn't expected him to be involved in this situation, but there he was, his eyes scanning the scene. "Is everything all right here?" Charles asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The moment Charles spoke, Daniel's expression shifted from anger to confusion. He wasn't used to seeing anyone challenge him, let alone someone with the air of authority that Charles possessed. Charles stood with a confidence that made even the agents behind him take notice. Maria gave Charles a small nod, her face a mixture of surprise and recognition. She hadn't anticipated his arrival, but his presence seemed to throw Daniels off balance. For a brief moment, the officer hesitated, unsure whether to confront Charles or to continue his aggression toward Maria. "You know her?" Daniels asked, his voice now unsure, as if he were grasping for any shred of authority he had left. Charles stepped closer to the officer, his eyes narrowing. "I do," he said slowly, "and I suggest you leave before things escalate any further." For a long moment, Officer Daniels just stared at Charles, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He clearly wasn't used to anyone telling him what to do, least of all someone like Charles. Daniels glanced around, his eyes shifting between the Secret Service team and Charles, then finally landing on Maria. His anger still burned in his chest, but something in his gut told him this wasn't a fight he could win. "Fine," Daniels muttered, taking one last, seething look at Maria. "But you haven't heard the last of this." He turned on his heel and walked back to his patrol car, slamming the door behind him. Maria let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She watched as Daniels drove off into the night, the sound of the car's engine fading into the distance. But despite the fact that the immediate danger had passed, she knew this wouldn't be the end. Daniels was a man who held grudges, and she could already feel the tension building in her chest. She knew he wouldn't forget this encounter. Charles turned to her and offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Maria nodded slowly, though the weight of the situation still pressed down on her. "I will be," she said quietly. The Secret Service agents, who had been standing at attention, began to relax now that the situation seemed to be under control. The agent who had spoken first stepped forward, his eyes still locked on Charles. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice skeptical. Charles glanced at Maria, then back at the agent. "Let's just say I'm an old friend of hers," he replied cryptically. Maria couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Charles was no ordinary man. She wasn't sure how much she trusted him after everything that had happened between them, but she couldn't deny that his arrival had made a huge difference tonight. "Well, whoever you are, thanks for stepping in," the first agent said, still wary but grateful nonetheless. "We appreciate the help." Maria didn't answer immediately, her mind racing as she processed everything that had just happened. She had been so close to danger, so close to being caught in something she couldn't control. But with Charles and the Secret Service team by her side, the immediate threat had passed. For now, at least. Charles turned to leave, but Maria called out to him, her voice sharp. "Wait." He stopped and looked back at her, a slight frown on his face. "What's up?" Maria narrowed her eyes. "What are you doing here, Charles?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Charles hesitated before responding, his expression unreadable. "I heard something," he said finally, "and I thought it might be important." The tension that had eased moments ago rushed back in. Something didn't feel right. Maria had a bad feeling deep in her gut. This wasn't just about Officer Daniels anymore. The air around Maria grew colder as she watched Charles, the man she once trusted, stand there with a look that told her he wasn't being entirely honest. Her heart beat faster. Something wasn't right, and she could feel it deep in her bones. Officer Daniels had been bad enough, but now Charles was here, and she didn't know whether he was friend or foe. Maria's eyes narrowed as she took a step closer to him. "What do you mean? You heard something?" she asked, her voice low and steady, though every part of her wanted to scream. "Why are you really here, Charles?" Charles's gaze flickered for a brief moment, and he shifted uncomfortably under her questioning stare. The agents behind Maria remained silent, their eyes fixed on him, but they knew that her safety was the priority. They didn't trust him, and neither did Maria, not anymore. Charles finally broke the silence, though his words were measured. "Look, Maria," he said, his tone soft but firm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I've been following some leads, things I thought might involve you. I wasn't sure if you were in danger or not, but when I saw you and that officer—" He trailed off, not finishing the sentence. Maria didn't believe him. She knew too well that Charles wasn't the type to come to her aid without some kind of agenda. After everything that had happened between them in the past, she was hardly convinced by his explanation. "You think I'm in danger?" Maria asked, her voice sharp. "Why didn't you reach out to me first, Charles? Why didn't you let me know you were looking into me?" Charles hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing his features. "I couldn't. It was complicated, okay?" he said quickly. "I thought I could handle it on my own, but I was wrong. The moment I saw you, I knew I needed to step in. I didn't want anyone else to get involved, but when I saw you being harassed by that officer, I couldn't just stay back anymore." Maria took a step back, processing his words. She didn't know what to think. Her past with Charles was full of secrecy and broken trust, and she wasn't sure she could trust him again. He had abandoned her once before when she needed him the most. She couldn't forget that. But despite her reservations, Maria couldn't ignore the fact that Charles had just saved her from a potentially dangerous confrontation. It wasn't like him to take risks for others, especially after what had happened between them. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her with a look of genuine concern. "Why now?" she asked, still skeptical. "Why after all this time?" Charles looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because I've seen the way things are escalating, Maria, and I know you're in a dangerous position. If you don't trust me, fine, but I'm not going anywhere. Not until I make sure you're safe." Maria's mind raced. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest, suffocating her. She had known danger before. Every day of her life had been a careful dance with risk, but this felt different. The stakes were higher now, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she could handle it on her own. She had people she could rely on, but even the Secret Service agents couldn't stop everything that was coming her way. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Maria finally let out a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as she turned toward the agents. "What do we do now?" she asked them, her voice tired but resolute. The agent who had spoken to Daniels earlier stepped forward, his face stern but understanding. "For now, we get you somewhere safe," he said. "You can't stay out here in the open. It's not just Officer Daniels we're worried about. There are others who might be involved, people who don't want you out here in public." Maria looked at Charles, who nodded grimly. "He's right. You're not safe yet. Whoever you're dealing with, they've got eyes everywhere." A cold chill ran down Maria's spine. The thought of being watched, of being hunted by unknown enemies, made her feel exposed. For the first time in a long while, she realized that her life was no longer in her hands alone. There were forces at play far beyond her control, and she wasn't sure if she could outrun them. "Where do we go?" Maria asked, the question leaving her mouth before she could stop herself. The agent glanced at his team before turning back to her. "We've got a safe house set up. It's off the radar. No one will know you're there. It'll give us time to figure out who's behind this and how to stop it." Maria hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She didn't want to go into hiding, but she knew she had no choice. Her enemies were closing in, and the only way to stay one step ahead was to disappear for a while. Without saying another word, Maria and Charles climbed into the back of the black SUV, the agents taking their positions in the front. As the car sped off into the night, Maria couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation sink deeper into her chest. For the first time in years, she was truly afraid. She didn't know who to trust, and she didn't know how long she could stay hidden. The only thing she knew for sure was that this was just the beginning. The safe house, hidden in a quiet suburban neighborhood, was everything Maria needed right now. Isolated, secure, and quiet. The agents led her and Charles inside, where the air was still and everything seemed too calm for comfort. The house felt like a fortress, with locked doors, high-tech security systems, and surveillance cameras everywhere. Maria sat down on the couch, trying to gather her thoughts, but her mind was racing. She had always been good at staying in control, but tonight had shaken her. The past had a way of creeping back in, and Charles's sudden appearance had stirred up old memories she wasn't ready to confront. Charles, sitting across from her, didn't say anything at first. He seemed to understand that she needed time, but there was a tension between them that neither of them could ignore. "Maria," he said after a long silence, his voice low, "you need to understand that this is bigger than you think. There are people who want you out of the picture, and they've been watching you for a while." Maria looked at him, her face unreadable. "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "I've been dealing with this for years, but now it's different. This is no longer just about me. I have a bigger target on my back than I ever imagined." Charles stood up, his expression serious. "That's why we need to figure out who's pulling the strings. And we need to do it fast. Because the longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes." Maria nodded slowly. She knew he was right. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. And the clock was ticking. The next few hours would be crucial. Time was running out, and Maria was about to be thrust into a battle far bigger than she could have ever imagined. The dim light in the safe house flickered as the team gathered around the table. It was late, and despite the hours that had passed since the confrontation with Officer Daniels, the tension hadn't eased. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Maria sat at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the faces of the men and women who had worked with her in the past, now standing by her side once again. Charles had been brief with his explanation of what had happened, but Maria knew there was more he wasn't saying. She could see it in his eyes, the hesitation, the guarded expression. She didn't like it, but she wasn't in a position to push him for answers. Not yet. "All right," the lead agent said, breaking the silence. He was a tall, no-nonsense man with a scar running down his cheek. His name was Agent Holt, and he had been with the Secret Service long enough to know that when things went sideways, they usually went sideways fast. "We have to figure out what we're dealing with here." Maria shifted in her seat, folding her arms across her chest. "I need to know exactly who is after me, Agent Holt," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not going to sit around and wait for them to make their next move. We need to be proactive." Holt nodded, but there was a look of caution in his eyes. "We're working on it," he said. "But whoever's pulling the strings is good at covering their tracks. We've tried to track their movement, but they've been smart, too smart. Right now, we only have a few leads, but they're not enough to take action." Charles, who had been silent until now, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "That's not good enough," he muttered. "We don't have the luxury of time." Maria shot him a look. "I know, but rushing in without a plan will get us killed." Charles didn't respond, but his jaw clenched in frustration. He knew Maria was right. The last thing they needed was to make a hasty move that could tip off their enemies. The team was silent for a moment, each person deep in thought. Maria could feel the pressure building. The longer they stayed in hiding, the more vulnerable they became. Whoever was after her wasn't going to stop. They had already shown that much. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. "We need to get ahead of this," Maria said, breaking the silence. "We can't let them dictate the terms of this game. We need to find out who's involved, and we need to do it now." Agent Holt finally nodded. "We'll start pulling more information. It might take some time, but we'll get something. Until then, you're staying here. It's the safest place we have." Maria didn't like the idea of being cooped up, but she knew it was the best option for now. She could feel the weight of her situation bearing down on her, and the uncertainty gnawed at her every thought. Who were these people, and what did they want from her? And more importantly, how far would they go to get it? The following days felt like a blur. Maria barely left the safe house, staying holed up with the team while they worked tirelessly to uncover any leads. She spent hours on the phone, speaking with contacts, trying to piece together the puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every passing hour. But the answers didn't come easy. In the midst of all this, Charles remained close by her side, his presence constant but frustrating. Despite his attempt to help, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't being entirely honest with her. He had been part of her life once, but things had ended badly between them. She couldn't just ignore that history. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, Maria watched Charles as he meticulously reviewed a set of documents. He glanced up at her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before he returned to his task. "Something's not right, Maria," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I've been following the leads, and there's no clear pattern. Whoever's behind this has covered their tracks well. We're running out of time." Maria didn't respond right away. She knew he was right. Time was their enemy now, but there was something more pressing on her mind. "Charles," she said, her voice steady, "what aren't you telling me?" Charles stiffened, his pen pausing midair. He didn't look at her. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice a little too casual. Maria didn't buy it. "You've been acting weird since you showed up. You're hiding something, and I need to know what it is." For a moment, Charles remained silent, his face unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's not something I can just tell you, Maria," he said quietly. "It's more complicated than you think." Maria's patience was wearing thin. "I don't care how complicated it is. If we're going to survive this, I need to know everything. No more secrets." Charles looked up at her then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He hesitated, his gaze shifting between her and the documents on the table. "All right," he finally said, "but you're not going to like it." Maria's heart sank. "What is it?" Charles exhaled deeply, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The people after you aren't just anyone. They're connected, very connected, and I think you've crossed paths with them before, whether you know it or not." Maria's mind raced. "What do you mean? Who are they?" Charles hesitated again. "I'm not sure of all the details yet, but I think it's related to a case you were involved in a few years ago. Something big. Something that was supposed to stay buried." Maria froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She had been involved in many cases, but the one that stood out the most was the one she'd spent years trying to forget. The one that had changed everything for her. "What case?" she whispered, dreading the answer. Charles met her gaze, his expression grim. "The one with the missing files. The one you handled right before everything went south. The one that almost cost you your career." Maria's blood ran cold. She had hoped that chapter of her life was over, buried beneath layers of time and distance. But now, it seemed, the past had come knocking on her door once again. "I thought it was done," she whispered, more to herself than to Charles. "I thought no one knew." "They knew," Charles said softly, "and now they want payback." Before Maria could respond, there was a sudden, loud bang at the front door. The sound was so forceful it shook the walls, and for a moment, no one moved. Then the door was slammed open, and 3 masked men burst into the safe house, guns drawn. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she sprang into action, instinctively reaching for the gun tucked in the waistband of her pants. The agents scrambled to respond, but they were caught off guard. The men moved quickly, and before anyone could react, Maria felt a sharp pain in her shoulder. She gasped, her vision blurring as she staggered back. The last thing she saw before everything went black was Charles, his face filled with horror, reaching out to her. The room was spinning. Maria blinked, trying to shake off the haze that clouded her mind. Her shoulder throbbed with pain, and she could feel the sticky warmth of blood against her skin. She was lying on the floor, her body heavy and unresponsive. "Maria." Charles's voice was frantic, but there was no comfort in it. She tried to sit up, but her head swam with dizziness, and she collapsed back onto the cold floor. The last thing she remembered was the sound of footsteps as the intruders dragged her away, their voices muffled in the distance. The safe house, once a fortress, now felt like a tomb. Maria's mind raced. She had failed. She hadn't been fast enough, hadn't been prepared enough. Whoever was after her had just taken everything she had worked so hard to protect. And now, she was theirs. Maria's body felt like lead. She could barely move, the pain in her shoulders so intense that it overshadowed everything else. The world around her seemed distant, a blurry haze that refused to clear. She tried to focus, but the sounds around her, footsteps, muffled voices, the hum of machines, seemed so far away. The darkness that had taken over her vision was suffocating, and her mind was scrambling to make sense of it all. She felt cold, colder than she ever had before. But then, slowly, her mind began to focus on the present. The sharp sting of pain in her shoulder, the feeling of the floor beneath her, hard and unyielding, the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. She was alive. But for how much longer? Her breathing was shallow, but it was there, keeping her tethered to reality. She couldn't afford to slip away, not now. Not when everything had fallen apart. The door creaked open, and she heard someone step inside. Footsteps. Familiar footsteps. It was Charles. "Maria, can you hear me?" His voice was soft, but she could hear the panic laced in his words. "Maria, please, stay with me." She couldn't speak. She wanted to, but her throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. Her mind was too foggy to form words, but she managed to squeeze her fingers, hoping he would understand. "Thank God," he whispered, his hand gently grasping hers. She could feel his warmth, the way his fingers wrapped around hers with a sense of urgency. "We're going to get you out of here. Just stay with me." Maria wanted to tell him to stop. She didn't want him to promise anything he couldn't keep. She didn't want to rely on him. Not after everything. But the words didn't come. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of a door slamming open, followed by shuffling footsteps. More voices. More people. When Maria woke again, it was different. Her head felt clearer, though still foggy, and her shoulder no longer throbbed as violently. But the feeling of being trapped, of being somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, weighed heavily on her. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through her chest, forcing her back onto the hard surface she was lying on. It was a bed. A clean, sterile bed in a cold room. She blinked, squinting at her surroundings. The room was small, with white walls and metal fixtures. It didn't look like any hospital room she had ever seen. It was too clinical, too cold, too impersonal. Her hand instinctively went to her shoulder, but when she touched the bandage, she realized she was no longer wearing her own clothes. Someone had dressed her in a simple hospital gown, and her body was wrapped in tight bandages. There was no sign of the agents, no sign of Charles. She was alone. Panic began to rise in her chest. Where was everyone? Where was Charles? Had they left her behind? Her mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. The safe house had been invaded. The intruders had taken her. Had they taken the others, too? Had Charles been caught? She fought the wave of nausea that hit her and tried to sit up again. This time, the pain wasn't as sharp, though it still made her wince. She steadied herself, swinging her legs off the side of the bed. The cool floor touched her bare feet, grounding her, and she took a deep breath, trying to clear the fog from her mind. The room was quiet, too quiet. It felt like she was the only one alive in the entire building. She needed answers. She needed to find out what had happened. Who was behind this? And what did they want from her? With slow, careful movements, Maria stood. Her body was weak, and she had to steady herself against the wall, but she refused to lie back down. She couldn't afford to rest, not while there were so many unanswered questions. There was a small window across the room, just big enough for someone to peer through. She moved toward it, peeking out. The view was blurry, but she could tell she wasn't in the city anymore. The area looked isolated, surrounded by tall trees, far from any road she recognized. Her gut told her that she was deep in the woods, far away from any help. A feeling of dread crept into her chest. Whoever had taken her was determined to keep her isolated, to keep her from escaping. Maria turned away from the window, her eyes scanning the room for any clues. There had to be something that would tell her where she was or how to get out. The door suddenly opened, and Maria froze. A tall man stepped inside, wearing a dark suit and sunglasses, despite being indoors. He didn't speak immediately, but his eyes took her in, studying her carefully. There was a chill in the air, and his presence felt menacing. Maria didn't wait for him to make the first move. Her training kicked in, and before he could react, she was already on the offensive. She lunged at him, but he was quick. dodging her attempt to grab him. He easily sidestepped, a smug smile forming on his face as he watched her struggle. "You really think you're going to escape?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. Maria glared at him, her fists clenched. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice hoarse but defiant. "What do you want from me?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer, his expression hardening. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. "But first, you need to understand something. You're not as important as you think you are." Maria's blood ran cold. He had said it in a way that made it clear. He wasn't afraid of her. And whatever plans they had for her, it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something bigger. "Where's Charles?" she demanded, not willing to back down. The man's eyes flickered for a moment, and Maria caught a glimpse of something. Fear, maybe, or uncertainty, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Don't worry about him," the man said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "He's not your problem right now." Maria's stomach twisted in knots. She didn't know what was happening, but she was running out of time. "Tell me what you want," she said again, her voice quieter but more insistent. "Why am I here?" The man took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "It's simple. You're here because you've seen too much, and now you're a liability." Maria's heart dropped. She had known this was coming. She had known it from the moment she crossed paths with the officer. She had been too involved, too close to the truth. And now, someone was going to make sure she could never expose it. He smiled, coldly. "But don't worry, you won't be here for long." The last words echoed in her ears, and the door slammed shut behind him, leaving her in the silence again. But this time, the silence didn't feel comforting. It felt like the calm before a storm. And Maria knew, without a doubt, that things were about to get much worse. Maria stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The man's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating her. "You're a liability." Those words echoed over and over in her mind. She had always known the stakes were high, but this was something else. Whoever these people were, they didn't just want to stop her. They wanted to erase her completely. Her mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let them get away with whatever they were plotting. But as she stood there, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread, she knew that escaping this place wasn't going to be easy. Maria's eyes scanned the room once more. There had to be something, anything that could help her. She was trained for situations like this, but she was also human. Her body was still recovering from the injury, and her mind was overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her reality. She needed to stay calm. She needed to think. The room had a small bathroom attached to it, and as she quietly moved toward it, she noticed a small set of cabinets under the sink. She opened the door cautiously, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. There were only a few supplies, towels, a toothbrush, and a first aid kit. Maria grabbed the kit, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside, she found bandages, antiseptic wipes, and a small pair of scissors. She didn't have time to waste. She had to escape. Her mind flashed to the faint image she had seen through the window earlier, the wooded area surrounding the building. She could make it. She wasn't going to let them keep her locked up like this. The first step was getting out of the room, and the second would be finding a way to make her way through the woods without being caught. Before she could gather her thoughts any further, a loud knock came at the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. Maria froze, her body tense. She couldn't afford to be discovered yet. She quickly shoved the first aid kit under the sink and moved back to the bed, trying to act like she had never gotten up. The door creaked open, and another man stepped inside. He wasn't the same as the first one. This man was younger, his eyes sharp and calculating. He looked at Maria with a mixture of suspicion and something else, something colder. "How are we feeling today?" he asked, his voice clipped, almost mechanical. Maria didn't respond at first. She was watching him closely, trying to read his movements. She knew better than to give away anything to these people. "I'm fine," she finally said, her voice steady, though her insides were anything but calm. "What do you want from me?" The man's eyes narrowed. "We just want you to cooperate," he said, taking a step closer. "You've been through a lot, and we don't want things to get any worse. You need to understand that. Maria resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Cooperate? She'd never been one to back down, and certainly not to people who thought they could control her. I don't cooperate with people who don't tell me the truth, she shot back, her voice low but firm. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled coldly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That's your choice, Maria. But know this, we're not in the business of asking for permission. You're here because we need you. You've seen too much to be left free. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. Too much. She'd known it from the moment they took her. They knew about the case. They knew about everything. Whoever was behind this, they weren't playing games. This was serious. But Maria wasn't about to let fear take over. She needed to stay focused. She needed to get out. The man continued to stand there, his eyes still on her, studying her every move. Maria tried not to show how much he was getting under her skin. She refused to let him think he had control over her. Do you know who I am? She asked, her tone sharp. The man raised an eyebrow, as though surprised by her question. I don't care who you think you are, he said, but you'll learn that it doesn't matter. You're not in control here. Maria's lips tightened, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that talking didn't always get you what you wanted. It was better to show people who you were through your actions. The man took a step back, his eyes still fixed on her. I'm going to leave now, he said, but I'll be back. And when I come back, we'll talk more. In the meantime, I suggest you get some rest. Without another word, he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Maria let out the breath she had been holding, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to calm herself. She couldn't stay here much longer. She needed to move, to get out of this place before it was too late. She glanced around the room again, looking for any other signs of weakness in the building, but everything was still too quiet. Hours passed. The sound of footsteps outside her door became a constant, reminding Maria that she wasn't alone. She knew they were watching her. It was only a matter of time before they came to check on her again. It was late at night when she finally heard the noise she had been waiting for. The sound of the guard walking down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the distance. Maria didn't hesitate. She grabbed the first aid kit from under the sink and quickly wrapped a few of the bandages around her shoulder to stop the bleeding. She winced at the pain, but the discomfort was nothing compared to the urgency of her situation. She moved silently toward the door, her heart racing with each step. If she could just get to the hallway without being seen, she would have a chance. She stood in front of the door for a moment, taking a deep breath before pressing her ear to it, listening for any sounds on the other side. Nothing. The coast was clear. Maria quietly turned the doorknob, stepping out into the dimly lit hallway. The corridor stretched out in both directions, silent except for the occasional creak of the building. She knew she had to move fast. She headed toward the end of the hallway, where she had seen an emergency exit earlier when she had been brought into the building. It was a long shot, but it was her best option. As she moved closer to the exit, Maria's mind raced. The escape wasn't going to be easy, but she couldn't afford to wait any longer. If she didn't act now, she might never get another chance. The door was within reach. Her breath hitched as she reached for the handle, ready to push it open, but just as her fingers touched the cool metal, a loud voice shouted from behind her. "Stop!" Maria froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't have time to think. She pushed the door open and ran. The chase was on. Maria's heart hammered in her chest as she bolted through the door and into the night. The cold air hit her face like a slap, sharp and biting. Her legs burned as she ran, the adrenaline surging through her veins. Every instinct in her screamed to keep moving, to get as far away from the building as possible. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't afford to stop and think. Behind her, she heard the doors swing open, the sound of footsteps pounding on the pavement growing closer. She could hear shouts, the voices of the guards calling out to each other, coordinating their pursuit. They were closing in, and she knew she couldn't outrun them forever. The forest loomed ahead, dark and dense, the trees casting long shadows in the pale light of the moon. She had no choice but to head in that direction. The trees would give her cover, even if it was only temporary. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her injured shoulder throbbing with each step. She could feel the blood seeping through the bandages, but there was no time to worry about that. She pushed herself harder, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the forest. As she reached the edge of the trees, she glanced over her shoulder. The guards were getting closer, their figures silhouetted against the faint light of the building. Maria gritted her teeth and forced herself into the woods, ducking under low branches and scrambling over uneven ground. The forest was thick, the underbrush grabbing at her legs, but it provided some semblance of safety, at least for now. She couldn't hear the guards anymore, but she knew they were still there, hunting her. She had to keep moving. She needed to get as far away from them as possible. Maria's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. She could keep running, but she couldn't outrun them forever. They had the resources to find her. The only way she could survive this was to turn the tables. She had to fight back. A rustling sound behind her snapped her back to the present. She turned, panic flashing through her veins, but it was only the wind. She exhaled sharply and kept running, her pace slowing only slightly as she tried to get her bearings. She needed to find shelter. Through the trees, she saw a faint glow ahead. Lights. The distant glow of what looked like a cabin or a small building. She could take refuge there, regroup, and come up with a new plan. Maria's breath was coming faster now, but she pushed through the exhaustion. Her legs were screaming at her to stop, but she didn't have time to rest. The cabin was closer now, and she could hear the distant hum of a generator, the faint sound of someone moving inside. She reached the cabin door and paused, her hand resting on the handle. She held her breath, straining to listen for any signs of life inside. When she heard nothing, she carefully turned the knob and slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her. The cabin was small and dark, but it offered the cover she desperately needed. She took a moment to catch her breath, her eyes scanning the room. There were no lights, but there was a faint glow coming from a small window. It was a sparse, utilitarian space, with basic furniture and a wood-burning stove. No sign of anyone living here full-time, but it looked like it could provide some temporary shelter. Maria didn't waste any time. She moved to a small table near the window and rifled through the drawers. There were some old maps, a few tools, and some dry food. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her shoulder was still bleeding, and the pain was becoming unbearable. She needed to stop the bleeding before it got worse. She grabbed a piece of cloth from the drawer and carefully wrapped it around her shoulder, wincing as she applied pressure. The makeshift bandage would have to do for now. As she sat on the edge of the table, catching her breath, Maria's thoughts turned to Charles. What had happened to him? Had he been taken, too? She couldn't believe that he had just disappeared after everything that had happened. He couldn't have abandoned her, not after everything they had been through together. She pushed the thought from her mind. There was no time for doubt. She had to stay focused. The clock was ticking, and she needed to figure out her next move. Just then, she heard a sound outside. The crunch of footsteps. Her breath hitched, and she quickly ducked behind the table, her heart racing. She couldn't afford to be seen. The footsteps grew louder, and the door to the cabin rattled slightly. Maria held her breath, hoping whoever it was wouldn't notice the subtle movement of the door. The sound of the steps came closer, and then silence. Maria's mind was spinning. Had they found her already? But then, through the small crack in the window, she saw a figure. A familiar figure. It was Charles. He was alone, looking over his shoulder as he walked cautiously toward the cabin. His face was bruised, his clothes disheveled, but there was no mistaking the relief on his face when he saw the door slightly ajar. Maria felt her heart skip a beat. Was it really him? She watched as he hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. "Maria?" he whispered, his voice strained. "Maria, it's me." Maria couldn't believe it. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and quickly moved toward the door, her heart swelling with relief. She didn't even realize she was crying until she heard her voice crack as she called out his name. "Charles," she whispered, her voice shaking. He turned toward her at the sound of her voice, his eyes wide with surprise and relief. For a brief moment, neither of them said anything. They just stood there, looking at each other, as if they couldn't believe that the other was really there. "I thought you were gone," Maria said. her voice barely above a whisper. Charles stepped forward, his face clouded with pain. "I thought I lost you," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't know where they took you. I've been looking for you ever since." Maria reached for him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I'm so glad you're okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. But even as she held him, she knew that they weren't safe yet. There was no time to relax. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop coming after them. But for the first time in a long while, Maria allowed herself a moment of comfort, feeling the warmth of Charles's presence. But then, just as quickly, reality hit her again. They were not alone. Outside, the sound of more footsteps echoed through the trees, and Maria's heart dropped. They had been found. "They're here," she said softly, breaking the embrace. "We need to go. Now." Charles's face tightened with determination. "We don't have much time. Let's move." With that, they turned and rushed toward the back of the cabin, the door creaking shut behind them as they disappeared into the darkness. The hunt had only just begun. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, and the steady pounding of their feet as Maria and Charles sprinted through the dense undergrowth. The darkness seemed to close in around them, the trees standing like silent sentinels, blocking out what little light the moon provided. Every step they took was one closer to being caught, but they had no choice. Staying in the cabin was a death sentence. They had to move. Charles was right beside her, his hand occasionally brushing against hers as they darted between trees, over rocks, and through thick brush. Their breathing was ragged, the effort of running at full speed in the dead of night pushing them to the limits of their endurance. Maria's shoulder ached, the makeshift bandage soaked through with blood, but she couldn't afford to slow down. "Not now. Do you think they'll follow us?" Maria gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. Charles didn't answer immediately. He was focused, his eyes scanning their surroundings, looking for any signs of pursuit. Finally, he glanced at her, his expression grim. "They're already on our trail. I'd be surprised if they didn't have dogs out here by now." Maria's stomach tightened at the thought. Dogs meant a faster pursuit, and it wouldn't take long for them to pick up their scent. They had to put as much distance between themselves and the cabin as possible, but the woods were vast, and the night was their only cover. They continued running for what felt like hours, the distance between them and their would-be captors growing. But they didn't dare stop. They kept pushing forward, even when exhaustion threatened to overtake them. Maria's mind raced as she thought of their next move. They needed a safe place, somewhere they could regroup, plan, and figure out how to get out of this alive. But they couldn't afford to make mistakes. One wrong turn, one misstep, and they could end up right back in the hands of the people hunting them. Suddenly, Charles stopped in his tracks. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she stumbled to a halt beside him, breathless. "What is it?" she whispered, her eyes darting around in the darkness. He didn't answer at first, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Maria followed his line of sight, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the thick expanse of trees. "Did you hear that?" Charles whispered, his voice tense. Maria strained her ears. For a moment, everything was quiet, too quiet. Then, just as she was about to ask him again, she heard it. A faint sound, like the crack of a twig, followed by the soft padding of footsteps. "They're close," she muttered under her breath. Charles nodded, his face pale. "We can't outrun them on foot. Not with their dogs. We need to find cover, fast." They didn't have much time. Without a word, Charles grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a large, gnarled tree ahead. They ducked behind it, crouching low to the ground. Maria's heart was racing as she tried to steady her breathing. They had to hide. They had to stay as still as possible. The sounds grew louder now, and she could hear the faint bark of a dog in the distance. The pursuit was closing in on them. Every minute that passed made their chances of getting away slimmer. They couldn't stay here for long. Maria glanced at Charles. His face was set with determination, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. She could feel it, too. The weight of everything, the chase, the uncertainty, the fear, was starting to take its toll. "How long do you think we can stay here?" she whispered, trying to sound calm, though her mind was spinning. Charles didn't answer immediately. His eyes darted around, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Not long. They'll be able to smell us if we stay too still for too long. We have to move again, but we need a better plan. Before Maria could respond, a flash of movement caught her eye. In the distance, a figure moved between the trees. The outline of a person. They were coming closer. Maria's breath caught in her throat, and she motioned for Charles to stay still. She couldn't be sure who it was. Was it one of the guards? One of their pursuers? Or was it someone else? Her heart was hammering in her chest as she watched the figure move closer. The person stopped a few yards away, seemingly oblivious to their presence. Maria's hand instinctively went to the gun at her waist, but Charles gently stopped her. "Wait," he murmured. "Don't make a move unless we have to." Maria didn't want to listen. Her instincts were screaming at her to act, to protect herself, to make sure they weren't caught. But she trusted Charles. He had been through enough to know when to fight and when to wait. The figure continued to move closer, and Maria's hand tightened on the gun. She couldn't tell if they were friend or foe, but she had to be ready. Suddenly, the figure stopped, their head turning sharply toward their hiding spot. Maria's breath froze in her chest. The figure's eyes met hers, and for a split second, everything stopped. "Maria?" The figure called, their voice clear in the night air. Her heart stopped. She couldn't believe her ears. She knew that voice. It was familiar, warm, a voice she had never expected to hear again. "Ben?" Maria whispered, her breath coming in short bursts. The man stepped closer, his face coming into view. It was Ben, one of her old allies, a former agent who had worked with her on a mission years ago. Maria hadn't seen him since the operation had gone south. She had no idea how he had found her, but in that moment, she didn't care. "What are you doing here?" Maria whispered, standing up from her crouch. She didn't dare raise her voice above a whisper. Ben's face was grim, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes when he saw her. "I could ask you the same thing," he said, his voice low but urgent. "You've got people hunting you, Maria. I'm here to help." Maria felt a wave of emotion wash over her, but she quickly pushed it aside. They didn't have time for emotions. They had to focus on survival. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice shaky but resolute. Ben didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the forest, his eyes alert as he scanned for any signs of movement. "I've been tracking you for the last couple of days," he said finally. "I had a feeling you were in trouble. I wasn't sure it was you at first, but when I saw the activity near the safe house, I knew it had to be." Maria's mind was spinning. Ben had been tracking her? Why? And why had he chosen now to show up? What was his angle? "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice hardening. "You don't know what you're getting into." Ben looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. "I know what I'm getting into, Maria. I'm not going to let them get to you." Before she could say anything else, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the quiet. Maria's eyes widened. The guards were getting closer, and they weren't alone. "Stay down," Ben whispered, pulling Maria back into the shadows with him. They huddled together behind the thick trunk of the tree, trying to remain as still as possible. The sound of voices grew louder. Their pursuers were coming, and this time, Maria wasn't sure they'd be able to outrun them. The forest seemed to close in around them as Maria crouched behind the tree with Ben, her heart racing. The voices grew louder, and the sound of heavy boots crunching the forest floor sent a chill down her spine. The guards were close, too close. She could hear the sharp, controlled commands of their leader, the low growl of the dogs as they sniffed the ground, following the scent trail. Ben's hand tightened on her arm, his eyes scanning the area as he listened carefully to the sounds of the forest. The moonlight barely pierced through the canopy above, leaving them shrouded in shadows. Maria held her breath, her mind focused entirely on the sound of their pursuers. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of the wind making her jump. They couldn't afford to make a sound. "Stay quiet," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. "We wait until they pass." Maria nodded, but inside, her thoughts were racing. The guards were closing in fast, and they had nowhere to run. Her injured shoulder ached with every movement, but she pushed the pain aside. She needed to think clearly. They could hear the guards now, their voices drifting through the trees as they moved in a line, the crunching of their boots almost synchronized. There were at least 5 of them, Maria estimated, maybe more, and the dogs would find them if they didn't do something fast. Ben motioned for Maria to stay still and then slowly reached into his jacket, pulling out a small device. He held it up to his ear, his eyes never leaving the shadows as he adjusted the dials. Maria barely noticed the small tremor in his hand as he worked quickly, scanning the frequency. "What is that?" Maria whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "Jam," Ben replied shortly. "It should mess with their tracking systems for a few minutes. Long enough for us to slip away." Maria didn't ask any more questions. She had no idea what kind of tech Ben was using, but at this point, she didn't care. If it could give them the edge they needed, she was all for it. The voices were so close now, and Maria could hear the bark of the dogs growing louder as they closed in on their position. The scent of her blood must have been thick in the air. It was only a matter of time before they found them. "Get ready," Ben murmured, pressing his hand against the trunk of the tree, his fingers moving in a calculated rhythm. He was tense, focused on the task at hand, but Maria could see the worry in his eyes.